So we'll go ahead and get started on the theory portion, which is pretty light compared to past lectures. The theory on this portion of the class is on authorization. Of course, we already talked about and went through authentication and had a lab, I think it was 0401, on logging in a user, keeping them logged in, putting that in a cookie, and having that login persist. So we've already went through authentication, which is the process of proving your identity. Authorization, a little bit different. Authorization is the process of determining if you have permissions, okay, to do something or view some data. Yesterday I was working with Tyler briefly and setting him up on a computer. And we created Tyler a user account so that he could authenticate to Windows. And then I put him in a group. And the group that I put him in was administrators. So there are user accounts and there are groups in Windows. And the group has permission. And so really the takeaway from Windows, from this example that I bring up, is that you do not want to put permissions, although you can, you really don't want to assign permissions to the user level, okay, ever, okay? And that's just kind of a rule of thumb that I learned early on in my IT career. You do not assign permissions, you do not want to assign permissions to a user. Because what happens, let's just say, that user quits your organization or they take a different role, right? Then you have to hire someone else to do their job, and then you have to go about reassigning all the permissions to match that user that just quit or got promotion or what have you. So the general rule of thumb in these systems, whether it's a Windows system or a website, or there's a lot of examples, right? I mean, you think of, we use Discord, and you could, on any individual user, grant them individual permissions, or you could just put the permissions in a group and assign the permissions to the group and then put the user in the group. Okay, so it's just much more efficient to have groups and to put users in groups, assign the permissions to groups. Like it's a simple process, okay, but it's just something you want to, kind of learn in the classroom and not learn on the job, to assign permissions to individual user accounts. Again, you can, in any system, assign permissions to account, whether it's Windows or Discord or your web application. Okay, so again, we're going to go through authorization, which is the process of determining if you have permission to do something. And so, you first have to know who they are before you give them permission, right? So in order to authorize someone, they must first authenticate. Makes sense? You can't give permissions if you don't know who they are. So if you kind of, you can read through this. This is all part of the reading, but if you kind of jump down into the different ways you could model this in the database, right here, this is an example of putting Boolean permissions on an individual user account. Again, this is not the recommendation, because what happens, again, if that user quits, then you have to reassign those same permissions to someone else, and it becomes a little bit more overhead than is necessary. Okay, so one approach that we could implement, not that we will, but that we could, is you could just put these flags on your users, Boolean flags, is this role or is that role, and again, that is an approach that you could have. Now, roles are kind of your synonym for your groups. Okay, so in Windows you've got user accounts and you've got groups. In many systems, it's just another name for a group, right? You just say a group of users is given a role, such as administrators or power users or quality analysts, or all these different roles that we've kind of already discussed in our project. And so instead of putting Boolean flags on our user documents, you could put an individual role on the user or an array of roles. And so this is a valid approach. And then this is just kind of part one, is you must put, again, it's a role property, and then it's either a string or an array. I think the way most of the time that I factor my code is even if it's a single role, I still put it in an array. It just has one element in it. Again, then when you get into permissions, again, you could, not that we will, you could put permissions on the user document. I don't like that as much. Again, I learned early on, put the permissions on the group or the role, and then put the user in the role. That's most efficient. So again, these become Boolean flags, and so notice here there's a permissions object, and so there's a subdocument here in our user account about what the user can do, which is, again, you can make it Boolean true or false, so it's either what they can do or cannot do if you mark it as false. And again, you will see systems out there that implement these kinds of permissions. However, kind of a combination of those approaches is we're actually going to have two different collections. We're going to have a users collection with an array of roles, and we're going to have a role collection and store, again, the roles are the groups, and then store the permissions in the roles. Okay, so I guess the takeaway is, when it comes down to it, there are many approaches that you could implement. I believe for efficiencies, this is the most efficient methodology of, users go into groups and the groups get the permissions, and there's a bunch of examples in the reading here that goes through, and they show you the different systems that use these pretty granular permission-based systems about what users can do. And for example, subscriber can do these things, contributor can do a little bit more, author can do a little bit more, editor can do a little bit more, administrator can do a little bit more. Windows, same kind of things. You've got users and groups, assign the permissions to the groups. I mean, that's really what we need to take away from this. When it comes to the errors that we are going to send to the client, we talk about status codes. We did start in the lab asking you to send back a 401 if a user is not logged in. We were giving the error of unauthenticated or unauthorized, right? So unauthenticated means you're not logged in. And 403 means, well, hey, we know who you are, you just don't have permissions to do that. So we know who you are, but you do not have permissions is 403. So, at the beginning of this class, probably weren't so familiar with error codes, but as we go into them, remember that 400 to 499 are all under the bucket of what's considered a client error. And then you get into 500, which is server errors. That typically means, and you guys are familiar with exceptions, when the server application throws an exception and it doesn't get caught, the server application might crash. And so if your server crashes, and throws an exception, that's an example of when you might see a 500 server error. So kind of a summary of various status codes. We're not doing a whole lot there. Okay, so to start to bring this in, really what we want to do, right, to start demonstrating this and how we can create permissions and create some roles, create some groups. Let's go ahead and spin up MongoDB Compass. And I'm going to work on my retro Amazon backend. So the task at hand, if you're following along, is we are looking at retro Amazon, and if we boot this up, port's already in use. If you guys have seen this, you've probably seen this, you need to go into your task manager, search for the Node JavaScript runtime environment, and just end the task. Okay? Because these servers, these Express servers, they run as a Windows process on your computer, and just because it's not actively running in the terminal doesn't mean that it might not also actively be running as a process. So you just got to go in Windows, end the process, and then run the server again. So I am up and running on port 3003, and if I open up Postman, I should be able to go ahead and log in a user on port 3003. For example, if I go to list all my books, it says you're not logged in. If I log in my user, now I go to list all books. You would all agree this is roughly where we left it off, right? So we got some routes locked down just by the 401 you're not logged in kind of thing. And if I clear this out on my cookies, clear my cookies, and I go back to list all books, I get my 401 unauthorized back. And so that's where we left it off. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to start creating these groups or these roles, and we're going to do so in Compass. I'm not connecting to localhost. I'm going to connect to my cluster. And retro Amazon. Right now I've got 3 collections. And again, so the mock-up is we're creating a role collection, singular, with each role has an ID, it has a string name, and a permissions subdocument. So let's go ahead and create a collection called role. And different ways to add data, but let's just insert document kind of manually. So this is an object ID. And the name developer, and permission. Again, I got a permissions is plural, as a subdocument. And permissions are where you can, get in detail what people can or cannot do, Boolean true or false. And so how about can list books, true, can insert book. True. And let me find my syntax error. Maybe it wants a comma here? No. Let's put the properties in quotes.
Oh, try getting rid of the second column.
There we go. Picky, picky, picky. Okay. So I'm going to kind of copy this a little bit right here because I'm just going to make two groups. The first group is developer. With a permissions sub document. And let's add another document. And quality analyst. And let's just give them one permission. How about can edit book? Or I can update book. And, this is just a template for getting started. Obviously, the details can be filled in when you have a more specific need. But this is just for demonstration purposes, right? So we've got two groups, and that's developer and quality analyst. If I go to my users here, let's see, we got a customer, right? So let's just, we only have customer, so let's go ahead and create our customer. Why not? So let's add a document called customer. And we don't have purchase book, but let's just say can purchase book. And let's also can list books. How about that? They can list them and they can purchase them.
When we make this name, they're case sensitive, right? Okay.
Yeah, I would code them as if they're case sensitive. Okay. So now we've got three groups. We've got the customer group, quality analyst, and developer. I'm going to add to my user account, I'm going to add the item of developer as a string. So I'm a customer and I'm a developer. Of course, developers can insert books, but customers cannot.
You did this as an edit document?
Yeah, I just went to user and I clicked on the edit document button and I added a field for my user account. I'll go ahead and just because, give myself all the permissions. So I'll make myself a quality analyst as well. So if I go back to user, Evan Gudmested, click on edit, role, add a field after item 1. quality analyst. So that I should have all the permissions. Now, we already brought in this Express auth package. And we're going to continue using this. There's two utility functions that we're going to use here called fetch roles and merge permissions. Because I'm in three different groups. I'm in three different groups, so I need to merge all their permissions together. And so fetch roles will essentially, based on a user, read the array of roles out of the user and put it in an array that you create. So like essentially right here, this line that I'm highlighting, you know, we'll take a user and then read all the roles out of the database that belong to that user and put it in an array called roles. So let's take a look at fetch roles first, okay, and check that out. So the way that fetch roles will work, here's my import on my user.js. I'm going to say fetch roles. So we're bringing in fetch roles. Let me see. Okay, so here when we're issuing an auth token, you're going to notice think about this. So we know, you know, just after looking at this, I'm just refreshing myself on the code. We know that user exists on our database and that their password matches. So we know it's a good user. So I think at this point we just need to take that user, call this fetch roles, await the fetch roles, but we do need to write one more module, which is find role by name. We need to write a database module to hit our database and look up a role by its name. So that's kind of where we are, and then we can write this line of code. So let's go ahead and open up our database module and write a find role by name method. So here's database. Let's go down to the bottom of database. I'm going to write an async function called find role by name, pass in a string essentially, connect to my database, do a find one, and return that role. It's worth double checking. I mean, the collection is called role, right? We just created. So we're hitting this role collection, we're passing in a string, and what comes back is the entire role object, including the permissions. Right? So we're finding a role by its string, and it's returning that role, including the permissions of that role. Of course, then we need to export that, find role by name. So I'll find role by name, put that in, include that in my export. And now we write that one-liner. This is all going to happen in my issue auth token function that we wrote. what we're going to wind up doing is we're going to put the permissions in the payload, because we put the payload in the token, and then we can use them on our routes. And so based on the permissions, can a user get to the route? Can they update a book? So on and so forth. Okay, so let's bring this in. So we just wrote a function called what? We wrote a function called find role by name. Find role by name. And let's, inside of our issue auth token, let's call fetch roles, which again, looking at the documentation, is right here. You could copy it, I suppose. We're going to have to refactor this if you do that. So roles is an array taking the user object that's a good user at this point, and then looking at the role array of the user, and for each role, returning the object of this database lookup. And so what I want to do here is I want to debug my user and say the user's roles are, and then stringify that array. I might have to for each it. I don't know if the stringify is gonna do what I want it to do here, because that's an array. So so let's for each this. For each. So I'll say roles, for each role, the user's role is role. So we're looping over our array and just printing it out. It might need the property of role.name. But let's just go ahead and log in my user, and I'll do that after booting up the server. Oh, DB is not defined. See, that's a problem with copy and paste, is you don't need DB. Victim of copy and paste. Let's save it. Now let's log in the user. Okay, welcome. And it is an object here, so I should be able to do the .name, which is a string. Log in my user, and the user's role is customer, the user's role is developer, the user's role is quality analyst. And so you could also say, and has the following permissions: JSON stringify role.permissions. Put the backtick here. Okay, let me get this on one screen so you can see that. So the user's role is that and has the following permissions of stringifying that object. Now if I log back in, look at it a little bit closer. Customer has these permissions, developer has those permissions, and quality analyst has those permissions. So don't really need this roles loop, okay, but I think it's helpful to kind of see how we're pulling the data out of the database in an array of roles, and each role in that array has a name and it has a permissions object. So that's the first utility function that's built into here. And the second one is here. You can kind of go back up to the top. Now we have a merge permissions function, which is exactly what it sounds like. You've got different groups and you need to merge their permissions all together. And so here, once we fetch the roles, which we've already done that, we're going to make another variable called permissions. And this is not an async. We're going to pass in the user and the array of roles. So kind of copy that one-liner. And so let's take a look. If I look at the user's permissions, I don't know that I need to stringify that again either. Let's just log the user back in. And let's see, merge permissions is not defined. Of course, we need to bring that in. Merge permissions. Log in our user. Welcome back the user. And it says the user permissions are, it is an object. In fact, if we take that stringify off, log the user in, you don't see it, it's just an object. Well, we've got this thing called payload. Right now the payload has an ID, it has an email, and it has an array of the user's roles. We're just going to add a permissions object to this payload. So we'll say payload dot permissions equals permissions. And then you put the payload in the JSON web token. And then that would ultimately be stored in the cookie, sent back and forth between the client and the server. So not a lot of code here. So not too bad compared to other lectures. What this allows us to do is work with some of these other functions like has permission. And so we can bring in this middleware called has permission, or more generically has role, right? So let's see if a user has permission, and notice you can pass multiple permissions here to access a route. And so I'm going to bring in has permission. Okay, and now we can lock down our routes based on, is the user logged in? Does the user have the permission? And what did we call it? We called it can list books, right? Can list books. And now because that permission is stored in the payload, we need to create a user that can't list the books. I mean, we don't have that yet. Because basically, even if you're a customer, you should be able to list the book. So let's log our user back in and make sure that they should still be able to list the books. Okay? Which is kind of what I would expect. Now to demonstrate maybe someone who can't list the books, so let me just remove one of my users' roles, right? So if I go into here, maybe someone is just a quality analyst. How about that? Because a quality analyst doesn't have that permission. So I'm going to go into my users here, Bob Duncan at gmail.com, and I'm going to edit for demonstration purposes. Bob Duncan is now a quality analyst. And so if I go to login Bob Duncan at gmail.com, pretty sure all my passwords are password. Bob Duncan is logged in, but if I go to list all books, let's see why that worked. I would not have expected. Let me take a look at why Bob Duncan. Yeah.
Put it in user. In the list for user.
I put what in the list of user?
Ask permission. Yeah. It only works on user now.
Oh yeah, it's for get all users, not get all books.
Oh, I put it on the wrong route.
Yes.
I list all users. I meant to put it on. That's what you're saying. Thank you. Put it on the wrong lists. I want to list all my books. Thank you for that. So if I open up my book list, and now I has permission. Okay. So I got to bring in has permission here. There we go. Let me go back and log me back in. Okay, I'm logged in. I can list books, that's good. Bob Duncan at gmail.com. Bob Duncan's logged in. And we get the 403 forbidden. You do not have the permissions can list book. Right? So the code's pretty simplified when you use this package to set up this kind of system. And you could expand this in a million different ways. What permissions do you want to grant? What do you not want to grant? Just create the group, put the permission on the group, write the logic so that when the user logs in, you get the list of permissions, you put the permissions in the payload, and then that middleware kind of handles the rest. Anybody need to see any part of this? Any questions, comments, concerns?
Line's breaking.
I can help you with that. All right, this was a short one, but it's in its working form. Okay. Now there's a little bit more that we need to do for the next lab around the corner, so we'll kind of walk through this exercise together, maybe here in 10 or 15 minutes. I'll help you out.